Thanks, Mary. The history of Rice is, as you know, as universities go, a short history, but I really doubt that you could find a university anywhere with a more interesting history, or a history where a university has come further from such a tenuous, uncertain beginning. But I think, to me, when you look at it, it is a history of people who have, such as Edgar Odell Lovett, about which Dr. Bowles spoke last time, who have come forward at critical times, done things that move Rice along, and in the process repeatedly enlarged the vision of what this place could become, because it had a long way to go. I thought what I would do tonight is go through just a few of those critical times, discuss them, where they are well known, such as the murder of Mr. Rice. I really don't want to get into that. I think all of you are familiar with that. I'll mention it and move on. I'll spend some time on some others. And then finally, what I might do, just because we've been so focused on this the last few years, is bring you up to date on things we've been doing the last 3 or 4 years, what we hope the effect of these things will be, and where we are in the current vision of where Rice ought to be going. I know sometimes, and you can do it tonight certainly, you can, if you like, save your questions till we're through, but I really would prefer if something strikes you that you just interrupt me, because you're really not interrupting me. I would welcome it, and I think it may create a more ongoing dialogue if it's something in which you have an interest. As I say, I'd like to begin. I would begin, I think, chronologically. We must start in 1900 with the murder of Mr. Rice. That, again, the role particularly that Captain Baker played in that, in preventing an early cremation and pushing the authorities to take action, and ultimately having the murderers convicted and the forged will declared to be a forgery. Without that, of course, there would not be any Rice University today. I might add that there is if anybody's really interested in that, there is a pretty good book that came out about 6 years ago called The Death of Old Man Rice by the New York University Press, a guy named Martin Friedland. It's heavy on legal procedures, and he questions whether all those procedures were really followed in the prosecution of these cases. But basically, it is a good book. The second thing I'd like to get into, and I was talking with Dr. Bowles earlier, I hope this wasn't covered in detail in his last lecture. I think we're going to have a different slant, although with the same conclusions here. And that is probably the most radical transformation that has ever occurred in the vision of what Rice University could be. And it occurred before Rice ever admitted a single student. And to do that, I'd like first to raise the question, what was Mr. Rice's vision? Where did he see this place going? So one thing I'd like to do is refer briefly to the originating documents. As you know, the Charter of Rice was executed in 1891, and it set out some very concrete requirements. The university was to be free. It was to be for the white children of Houston and Texas. It was to be non-sectarian. It was to be open to women as well as men, which was rather unusual in those days. And it could never incur debt. Those were concrete. But what was it? What was it affirmatively supposed to be? And if you go to the charter, there's something for everyone. The charter is not well written, and we'll get into that just in detail in a minute. But it provided that there should be established a public library and institute for the advancement of science and art. And then in somewhat more detail, it called for the, quote, the establishment and maintenance of a thorough polytechnic school for males and females designed to give instruction on the application of science and art for the useful occupations of life. As Professor Bowles has pointed out, William Marsh Rice never used the word college, never used the word university, and there is no reason to believe a college or a university is what he had in mind. Now, let me, against that background, when this was done, consider the conditions that surrounded it. First of all, Houston, Texas. Houston was a poor southern town. At the time, the Civil War had only been over 26 years. The South had not begun to get over the devastation of the Civil War. Houston was a dominantly agricultural community. It was a have-not society. I'm sure William Jennings Bryan carried it every time down here during that time. Less than 2% of all college-age men and women in the southern United States ever attended a day of college. There was not even a high school in Houston. Dr. Bowles referred to it as a truly impoverished academic atmosphere. So what was against that background, what caused Mr. Rice to be considering this? And the answer, you go back to a man named Caesar Lombardi, who was one of the first trustees of Rice. He was a man who had come over from Switzerland in 1860. He had been head of the school board, and he was big on education. He went before the city council with a plan for a public high school. They considered it and rejected it. The quote is, in one place, it was referred to as a highfalutin nonsense idea. Lombardi said he was in despair. Apparently his father-in-law had been a friend of William Marsh Rice in the early days, and when Mr. Rice was in town, he would come by and visit with Lombardi. Lombardi describes how he took him in a back room, locked the door so they wouldn't be disturbed, and urged him to help build a public high school, which he said was urgently needed. Now, he said, okay, I'll consider that, and before I go back to New York, I'll let you know, which he did not do. And then he asked him to send him his plans. About the same time, another future trustee of Rice, a man named Emmanuel Raphael, who had come over from England earlier and actually had been the rabbi for Houston during the Civil War, kind of an interesting fellow. He approached Mr. Rice and urged him to contribute to a fund to build a public library. This was I guess, around 1890. Houston did not get a public library until 1904. So it was you can just see the kind of things they were looking for. Mr. Rice came back to Lombardi and told him this. I'm not going to do that, he said. A high school ought to be built by the citizens of this place, and the city council has just got to face up to it. What he wanted to do, instead, he planned to endow an institution of learning separate and apart from the public school system, a sort of auxiliary to it. And as you really read this stuff, it's pretty clear what he had in mind was a very good trade school. Consider what the trustees had in mind. And here I would refer you to a book that's out of print, but if you go to Amazon.com, they'll find you a copy. It'll cost a little more. It's History of Rice University, which takes you up to 1963, by Frederica Miners. Quite a good book, has a lot of information in it. She refers in quotes from a 1905 writing by Emmanuel Raphael and James McAshan, another of the original trustees. We think it was the intention of the founder to give manual training, applied science, and liberal arts preference in the organization. And indeed, the bylaws of the board in 1905 refer to a school for instruction in the arts of design and such other branches of knowledge as in their judgment will tend to the elevation and employment of intelligent labor. It also stated this: this instruction shall be adapted to the comprehension and improvement of the mechanics and mechanics apprentices of Houston and its vicinity, being intended to bridge over the gap which now exists between science and the practical occupations of life. That's what he had in mind. Indeed, the next year, Trustee Raphael makes a trip to the East Coast. He goes in various technology schools and sees how they run it, how the budget is done, and all the things you need to start a school. Historian Miners conclude clearly at this time the trustees had in mind an institution more along the lines of the Pratt Institute than the university they finally created. There's every reason to believe that Mr. Rice thought this kind of place would be more practical than a high school. So, what happened between 1906 and when the school opened in 1912? How did it shift from a Institute of Applied Science to a university of the highest rank? How did this vision change? Well, to me, and this is a matter, history is not that clear, but to me it's reasonably clear that it occurred in their negotiations to hire Edgar Odell Lovett as the first president of Rice. Frankly, they concluded that Lovett was the best candidate and they were running out of other candidates. People were not clamoring for this job. There was no building, there was no nothing down here except this prairie where we are, which the great architect crammed, what do you call it, a level and stupid site. Okay, there was one time when he came down, there was particularly an evening when he spent with the trustees. And bear in mind, not one of these trustees was a college graduate. That was unusual in those days. He spent this evening where apparently there was a bit of a confrontation over just what he was being hired to do, what kind of place it was going to be. He later wrote about this in some detail. And it's kind of interesting looking back at it. First of all, he sort of sympathized with him. He said, they were successful men of business and facing as difficult a problem in trying to select a college president as a group of college professors would be if they set out to find a railroad president. Indeed, I think the chances might have been in favor of the college professors group. But he looks back at that evening, and one thing he didn't like was the designation institute. He said this: the very designation institute, if it did not mean a female seminary or one for defectives, meant an institute of technology. He concluded this, and I think this is very significant. He said, there was some hint of this that night, so I told them I could not be a party for any such undertaking that would not assure as large a place for pure science as for applied science. It was an entering wedge away from technology and toward the university idea. I've always thought it bore fruit in the future. So what did the trustees do confronted with that? Well, they were flexible people. Captain Baker writes him right away, says that the trustees have very little experience in education. They will give him a very free hand. He says, as a rule, they are broad-minded and liberal and desire in establishing the new institution to lay the foundations broad and deep and to employ the best talent available anywhere. And finally, he says, however promising may be your prospects at Princeton, you ought to be slow in declining. Such an opportunity rarely comes to one so young in life. Mr. Lovett was 36 years old at that time. Emmanuel Raphael writes him and says, we're going to pattern this on the what he called the Massachusetts School of Technology. And even in those days, MIT was a lot different than the Pratt Institute. So Levitt writes back January 18, 1908, and accepts. And he concludes his letter by saying the purpose of Rice is to educate students, quote, for commanding careers in the affairs of the world, close quote. So it came a long way in that exchange. Levitt comes on board, and the board, I'm sure at his suggestion, formally makes this decision that Rice Institute would aspire to university standing of the highest level. That's a phrase you'll recognize because it's repeated all the time. As Frederica Miners concludes, this decision removed the institute from the purely technical school category the trustees first contemplated. She also notes that Levitt was by this time proclaiming an intention and design larger than the trustees probably realized. It also concluded this, the board, in formal resolution, that Rice Institute, quote, would enter into a university program in the sciences. But clearly, seems to me, Levitt meant that as the opening wedge, and he was going to move them all the way. So well before before Rice ever admitted a single student, the university went through a more radical transition and vision than anything else any of us have ever done since. This was the key, it seems to me. Growing out of what Professor Bowles calls this impoverished atmosphere was this grandiose vision of an institution aspiring to university standing of the highest order. Now, years later, it's kind of interesting. You remember the desegregation case in the 60s to desegregate and charge tuition. In a wonderful touch of irony, when that court case was finally ended in the Texas Court of Appeals, the Texas court found that it was Mr. Rice's idea anyway. It concluded that as a matter, quote, as a matter of law, the primary purpose of the donor was to establish an educational institution of the first class. Mr. Rice, it never occurred to him, but I mean, it's now as a matter of law, you can find it in the books. I asked this question, were they unfaithful to Mr. Rice's vision? And my answer, I don't think so. These people were very close. You had some of his relatives on the board. You had people like Lombardi and Raphael who were very close to him. You had Captain Baker, who was his confidant and advisor. I think they probably felt that Mr. Rice had a fairly vague notion. If you read the charter, it is very vague. And that in any event, he would not mind a little elevation in the goal. But I'll just say it was a heck of an elevation from where they started.